Go.
Go.
All right.
We got some down.
Two down. Say that, police.
The call sounds familiar. A frightened wife, a volatile divorce, a police response that feels routine. Officers arrive expecting another domestic dispute. Raised voices, hurt feelings, a marriage collapsing in slow motion. Nothing more, nothing dangerous. But they are already too late. Because this call isn't about protection, it isn't about fear, and it isn't about escape, it's about time. Behind the calm voice and measured words is a woman carefully building a narrative, one that paints her as vulnerable, threatened, and desperate for help. Every sentence is deliberate. Every detail is placed exactly where it needs to be. What the officers don't know, what no one knows yet, is that the plan is already in motion. This is not a marriage falling apart. It is a murder plot taking shape, a beauty queen, a wealthy businessman, a paradise island where luxury masks betrayal. What began as a picture-perfect life, private planes, beachfront homes, and smiling family photos, has already rotted from the inside. An affair has turned into obsession, divorce has turned into warfare, and love has turned into something far darker. 5 days from this police encounter, everything will collapse. A robbery in the Bahamas, a bartender with secrets, messages that were never meant to be seen, and words so simple, so chilling, they erase any doubt. Kill him, just do it. This is the story of how playing the victim became the perfect cover, how paradise became a crime scene, and how one routine 911 call almost helped someone get away with murder. From the outside, the Shiver family looked untouchable. They lived behind gates, flew on private planes, vacationed where turquoise water met white sand and worry didn't seem to exist. Robert Shiver was the definition of success, a former linebacker at Auburn University. He carried the discipline of football into business. When his playing days ended, he didn't fade away. He built an insurance empire from the ground up in Thomasville, Georgia. Smart, relentless, and financially sharp, Robert turned risk into profit, and profit into freedom. Lindsay Shiver matched the image perfectly. A former beauty queen, Auburn graduate, polished, articulate, camera-ready. She knew how to command a room, how to present a flawless version of life. Together they were the couple people envied, the kind whose Christmas cards looked staged and whose vacations looked unreal. They had 3 sons, a massive home, a private jet shared through ownership, and a second life in the Bahamas. On social media, their story was effortless. Smiles, beach sunsets, family photos that felt almost too perfect. But perfection, when held up long enough, begins to crack. Robert's success came at a cost. His business required constant travel, meetings, flights, late nights. While he built wealth, Lindsay stayed home, managing the household and raising 3 young boys. Over time, the distance between them grew, not just physical but emotional. The marriage didn't explode, it eroded. By 2023, the tension was no longer subtle. Arguments replaced conversations, silence replaced affection. And beneath it all, resentment began to harden. But the breaking point didn't happen in Georgia, it happened in paradise. The Bahamas had always been their escape. With family money and access to private flights, island hopping was routine. On one of these trips, Lindsay walked into a beachside bar on Great Guana Cay, a place built for tourists, music, and fleeting connections. That's where she met Terrence Bethel. He was younger, carefree, a bartender with an easy smile and no responsibilities beyond the next drink order. To Lindsay, he represented everything her life no longer felt like: freedom, attention, excitement. What started as flirtation didn't stay harmless for long. The affair ignited fast and burned hot. Secret messages, private meetings, a second life forming just beneath the surface of the first. Lindsay wasn't just unhappy anymore, she was emotionally gone. And Robert noticed. By early 2023, he could feel it: the distance, the secrecy, the sudden changes in behavior. When he began asking questions, the answers didn't add up. Then something happened that pushed his suspicion into fear. In February 2023, Robert called 911, not to accuse but to protect himself. His wife had cut off his phone line, without warning, without explanation. He told dispatchers he believed she might be setting him up, that she could call police and claim he was dangerous. He wanted it on record. He told them he was afraid of being framed. That call would later feel prophetic. Soon after, Robert hired a private investigator. The results were devastating. Text messages, travel records, proof that Lindsay had been unfaithful. Not once, not accidentally, but deliberately. On April 5, 2023, Robert filed for divorce, citing adultery. The next day, Lindsay filed her own paperwork. They were done, but they weren't separated. Instead of clean distance, they were trapped under the same roof, Two people at war, sharing a house, children and assets worth millions. Separate bedrooms, shared resentment. Every interaction became a negotiation over control, money, custody, power, and Lindsay was losing ground. Robert had evidence, he had leverage, and in a divorce like this, leverage is everything. As the legal battle escalated, so did the volatility. Police were called more than once, not for violence, but for chaos. Accusations, following, arguments spilling into public spaces. Each time, Lindsay played the same role: the frightened wife, the overwhelmed mother, the woman afraid of her husband. Her delivery was calm, measured, never hysterical. She knew how to sound credible, but behind the scenes something far more dangerous was happening. While the divorce dragged on, Lindsay stayed in contact with Terence. The affair didn't end, it evolved, and with it came a new idea, one that crossed a line most people never approach. If Robert was gone, the divorce would be over. The money would be hers. The life she wanted would be possible. The idea didn't arrive fully formed. It grew slowly, through messages, through frustration, through fear of losing everything. Eventually, Lindsay took the next step. She brought Terence into the plan. Terence reached out to someone else, a man with a criminal past, someone capable of violence, someone willing to do what Lindsay would not. The goal was simple: kill Robert, make it look like a robbery, walk away clean. The Bahamas were chosen carefully. Fewer cameras, looser oversight, a place where tourists disappear into the background. Lindsay provided details: Robert's travel schedule, where he'd be staying, when he'd be vulnerable. Every piece mattered, and while the plan took shape, Lindsay continued her performance back home. She called police. She documented disputes. She made sure there was a record of fear. Because if anything went wrong, she wanted a story already written. And that brings us to the moment. Officers responded to what looked like just another domestic dispute, unaware that 5 days later the truth would explode across borders, because the robbery in the Bahamas was about to expose everything. By the time police arrived that morning, the story had already been rehearsed. Lindsay's voice was steady, controlled. She didn't sound panicked or frantic. She sounded reasonable, concerned, the kind of person officers instinctively trust. She explained that the divorce was volatile, that emotions were high, that she was just trying to protect herself and her children. It was a performance built on restraint. When officers asked whether her husband had put his hands on her, she didn't rush to accuse him of assault. She chose her words carefully. She said he had moved her out of the way of the car. Not punched, not struck. Just enough physical contact to plant the idea of danger without crossing into something that could be disproven. It was subtle, and it mattered. From the officer's perspective, this was familiar territory. A divorcing couple, conflicting stories, emotions spilling over into everyday logistics, cars, luggage, travel plans, no visible injuries, no independent witnesses, no clear crime, a classic he said, she said. The officers did what they are trained to do in those moments. They de-escalated. They warned both parties about physical contact. They advised separation. They documented the encounter and moved on. Case closed. Except it wasn't. Because this call wasn't about resolving a conflict. It was about creating a record. Lindsay needed documentation. She needed a paper trail showing that she felt threatened, that she had reached out to police, that there were issues in the marriage. If something happened to Robert later, she wanted history on her side. And something was going to happen. What the officers couldn't see was the second life Lindsay was living, one that existed entirely on encrypted messages and private conversations far from Georgia. In the Bahamas, Terence Bethel was no longer just a bartender or a lover. He was a conduit. Through him, Lindsay had reached someone capable of violence, someone with a criminal past, someone willing to turn planning into action. Their conversations weren't emotional rants, they were logistical. Where Robert would be, when he would be alone, how the scene should look afterward. The plan was chilling in its simplicity. Robert would be killed. It would look like a robbery. There would be no obvious connection back to Lindsay. She supplied the most important resource: information. Travel details, locations, habits, the kind of knowledge only a spouse would have. And while the plan matured, Lindsay doubled down on her public image. She continued to argue about vacations, about custody, about who had the right to travel with the children. Each disagreement added more tension, more witnesses, more documentation. Every interaction reinforced the narrative that the marriage was toxic and unpredictable. That July body cam footage, where officers advised them not to travel together, became another brick in the wall. She was building around herself. She wanted anyone looking back to see a woman trapped in chaos. What she didn't account for was something far less dramatic: chance. Just days after that police encounter, something went wrong. Not with the murder plan itself, but with the people involved. At the bar where Terence worked in the Bahamas, a robbery occurred. Security cameras were disabled. Money was taken. It looked like an inside job, and that's exactly why police focused on Terence. When Bahamian authorities seized his phone, they expected to find evidence related to the robbery, messages, contacts, planning. What they found instead was far worse. Text conversations, dozens of them, between Terence and Lindsay, sent just days before the Georgia police encounter. They weren't vague, they weren't ambiguous, they weren't jokes, they were explicit. Details about Robert's movements, where he would be staying, when he would be vulnerable, and then the message that ended everything: kill him, just do it. There was no context that softened it, no follow-up explaining it away, no sarcasm, just intent. In that moment, the robbery became irrelevant. The investigation exploded. Bahamian police immediately looped in US authorities. Phones were analyzed, message histories reconstructed. The timeline snapped into focus. The domestic dispute in Georgia, the affair in the Bahamas, the coordination across borders, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't fantasy. This was conspiracy. Within days, arrests followed. Lindsay Shiver was taken into custody in the Bahamas, alongside Terence Bethel and the man identified as the intended hitman. The charges were severe: conspiracy to commit murder. For the first time, the image shattered completely. The frightened wife became the alleged architect. The Paradise Escape became the crime scene. The routine police call became a prelude to an international case. Lindsay insisted it was all a misunderstanding. She claimed the messages were taken out of context, that they were exaggerated, emotional, never meant to be acted upon. But digital evidence is unforgiving. Unlike spoken words, messages don't forget. They don't soften over time. They sit exactly as they were written, waiting to be read, and when prosecutors laid them out, the narrative Lindsay had tried to control collapsed. Every calm police interaction now looked strategic. Every domestic call looked intentional. Every claim of fear looked rehearsed. The body cam footage, once unremarkable, took on new meaning. Her tone, her restraint, her precision. She wasn't spiraling. She was managing perception. The clock had been running the entire time. From the moment the affair began, from the moment the divorce papers were filed, from the moment she realized she might lose everything, and it stopped the second investigators read those messages. In the next chapter of this story, the case moves into the courtroom, where the illusion of control finally breaks and consequences replace calculation. The arrest didn't come with chaos. There were no dramatic chases, no last-minute escapes, no press waiting outside a courthouse. Instead, it came quietly, efficiently, on foreign soil. When authorities moved in at the resort in the Bahamas, Lindsay Shiver was no longer the composed woman controlling the narrative. She was a suspect in an international conspiracy. Alongside her were Terence Bethel, the bartender who had become her confidant and accomplice, and the man prosecutors said was prepared to carry out the killing. In a matter of hours, Paradise vanished. Phones were seized, passports were taken, statements were recorded, and the messages, the same ones Lindsay believed were safely buried, were now evidence. As the investigation unfolded, the structure of the plot became undeniable. This was not a moment of reckless emotion. It was a sustained plan. Prosecutors outlined how Lindsay had fed information to Terence: travel schedules, locations, windows of opportunity. She had discussed how Robert could be isolated, how the scene should look afterward, and how the violence should appear random, an unfortunate robbery in a place where tourists come and go. She wasn't asking questions, she was giving direction, and the message that sealed her fate, the one prosecutors would later describe as impossible to explain away, stood alone in its clarity. Kill him, just do it. Once that line entered the record, the case stopped being about interpretation. It became about accountability. Lindsay was extradited and formally charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The media seized the story immediately. A former beauty queen accused of plotting her husband's death, a lover turned intermediary, a tropical backdrop that made the betrayal feel even colder. But the courtroom stripped away the spectacle. There the focus was on facts, on timelines, on intent, on digital footprints that told the story Lindsay tried to hide. Her defense leaned heavily on minimization. They argued the messages were emotional exaggerations, that no murder ever occurred, that the plan was never completed, that words, however disturbing, are not actions, and technically they were right about one thing: Robert Shiver was alive. That fact changed everything, because while conspiracy is serious, it is not the same as murder, and in the justice system, outcomes often hinge not on what could have happened, but on what did. Prosecutors faced a decision. They could push the case to trial, putting every message, every betrayal, every private detail on display, or they could secure a conviction that ensured punishment without the risks of a jury interpreting intent differently. A plea deal emerged. Lindsay Shiver accepted it. In exchange for pleading guilty to reduced charges, The most severe count, murder for hire, was dropped. She avoided a long prison sentence. Instead, she was sentenced to probation, with strict conditions and supervision. Her freedom would be limited, monitored, and defined by compliance rather than bars. For many watching, the sentence felt jarring. How could someone who plotted murder walk free? The answer lies in the difference between outrage and law. No one was killed, no attack occurred, and conspiracy, while grave, carries different penalties depending on jurisdiction, cooperation, and outcomes. Terence Bethel and the third conspirator did not walk away so easily. They received prison sentences. Their roles were viewed as more directly tied to potential violence. Their futures were measured in years behind bars. Lindsay's punishment took a different form. She lost custody of her children. Robert Shiver was awarded full custody of their 3 sons. Lindsay's contact with them was reduced to supervised visitation only. Every interaction monitored, every moment controlled. The life she had fought so desperately to preserve was gone. The private jet, the luxury travel, the image of control, all of it disappeared. Robert, the man she tried to eliminate, rebuilt. He retained the family assets. He moved forward. He remarried. He created a new stability for his children, one that did not include constant conflict or hidden danger. And the house in the Bahamas, the place where the affair began and the plan took shape, stood as a silent witness, a symbol of how easily paradise can become a backdrop for betrayal. What remains most disturbing about this case isn't the failed plot itself, it's how close it came. If not for a robbery that drew attention, if not for a phone seized at the wrong moment, if not for messages written with too much confidence, the story could have ended very differently. The police body cam footage, the calm delivery, the restrained tone, the careful phrasing now reads like something else entirely. Not fear, but foresight. Not panic, but preparation. Lindsay wasn't unraveling, she was managing risk. And in the end, it wasn't violence that stopped her plan, it was evidence. This case leaves behind uncomfortable questions. How many people mistake control for calm? How often do warning signs hide behind politeness and polish? And how close do some crimes come to completion before chance intervenes? In the final part of this story, we step back and confront the aftermath, the lives altered, the children caught in the wreckage, and the lasting lesson this case leaves behind. When the case finally closed, there was no dramatic ending. No verdict read to a packed courtroom. No emotional confessions. No last-minute twists. Just consequences. Quiet, permanent, and irreversible. For Lindsay Shiver, the sentence on paper did not look like the downfall many expected. No long prison term, no life behind bars. Instead, probation, conditions, supervision. On the surface, it seemed almost merciful. But punishment is not always measured in years served. Sometimes, it's measured in what you lose forever. Lindsay lost custody of her 3 sons, the children she claimed to be protecting, the children she used as part of her public narrative, the children whose lives were destabilized by a plot they never knew existed. From that moment forward, she no longer made decisions for them. She no longer controlled their daily lives. Every visit became supervised, every interaction observed. The role she once held, as mother, as authority, as protector, was reduced to something conditional and monitored. Meanwhile, Robert Shiver, the intended victim, kept everything Lindsay had tried to secure through violence: full custody, financial assets, the freedom to rebuild. He did what survivors often do best. He moved on. He remarried. He created a new normal for his sons. He rebuilt a life without fear hiding inside it. The contrast was stark. The man who was nearly killed regained stability. The woman who tried to orchestrate his death lost control of everything she fought to keep. And that may be the cruelest irony of all. Because this case was never about passion or desperation. It was about control. Lindsay didn't want chaos. She wanted certainty. She wanted to decide how the divorce ended, how the money was divided, how the future looked. She wanted to eliminate variables, but control is fragile when it relies on secrecy. One message, one phone seizure, one robbery that had nothing to do with the murder plot. That's all it took. The same digital trail she trusted to stay hidden became the evidence that destroyed her carefully constructed image. Messages written in confidence turned into exhibits. Calm performances on body cam became suspicious in hindsight. The role of frightened wife collapsed under the weight of intent. This case forces a difficult realization. Danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives well-dressed, well-spoken, seemingly reasonable. Sometimes it calls the police first. The officers who responded that day did exactly what the law allows in a he-said, she-said situation. They de-escalated. They documented. They advised separation. At the time, there was no crime to charge. And that's what makes this story so unsettling, because the system didn't fail. It just didn't know what it was standing in front of. By the time the truth surfaced, the plot was already complete, just not executed. And that raises the question no one likes to ask. How many plans are stopped not by intuition or warning signs, but by accident? This case is a reminder that violence doesn't always come from rage. Sometimes it comes from calculation, from entitlement, from the belief that consequences are for other people. Lindsay Shiver believed she could manage perception long enough to change her reality. She was wrong. And now the life she once curated so carefully exists only in archived photos and courtroom records. The gated mansion, the private jet, the island paradise, all replaced by supervision schedules, court orders, and permanent scrutiny. What remains is not a cautionary tale about jealousy or divorce. It's a warning about narratives, about how easily calm can be mistaken for innocence, about how performance can mask intent, and about how close some crimes come to becoming irreversible history. This story ends without blood spilled, but not without damage. 3 children grew up knowing their mother tried to have their father killed. A family name became synonymous with betrayal, and a life built on appearance collapsed under the weight of truth. Sometimes the scariest crimes aren't the ones that happen, they're the ones that almost do. If you found this breakdown powerful, like the video to support this kind of storytelling, share it, because stories like this matter more when they're understood. And subscribe for more deep, real cases told without hype, without noise, just the truth behind the headlines. We'll see you in the next one.